Okay, so thanks very much everybody for joining. Our subject today is healthcare procurement in COVID-19 and beyond. We've got four fantastic speakers for you who will introduce themselves as we go through, which are hopefully going to give you very different perspectives on the issue. If I could introduce Neil Hind as our first speaker. Thank you, Neil.
Yes, so it's a good morning from me here in the UK, it's in Manchester at the moment. So I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the experiences from the NHS in England, especially around the work which I've been helping with in Greater Manchester. Just a bit of background for those who are not aware of where we are in Greater Manchester. We're something called an integrated care system, which means we tend to work not just in the health area, as in hospitals. We also work very closely with our GPs and our care homes as well as an integrated care system. So that puts us in a slightly different place than some other areas of our country. We're about 6% of NHS England, so we're quite a big area of spend. I think that the background for the NHS in England has been looking at focusing on cost in the main. There's an organisation called NHS Supply Chain, which some people may have heard of, and a lot of the NHS is encouraged to buy through NHS Supply Chain, which is a big central organisation, obviously with a massive amount of aggregated spend power across not only the country but across the world as well. So obviously the COVID-19 has impacted healthcare systems across the world, and we've all seen a massive change in how we've actually bought healthcare goods, and PPE especially has been in the press. You know, here in England it was in the press, in the news almost every day for end of March into April and even into early May as well. I think that the big challenge was increasing volumes. I think everyone saw sort of massive increase in the volumes they actually needed, and it was almost a perfect storm, I think, in the supply chain. Obviously, a lot of the goods that are used in the UK are bought in the Far East, in China especially. With the issues they'd had, a lot of the factories had shut down, only just opening up. Obviously, a massive drop in air travel, and a lot of the capacity which would have existed normally wasn't there to fly goods all over the world, and that increase in need as well was absolutely massive. Just to give you an example for us in Greater Manchester to help put this into perspective, we use about 1 million IIR masks, which is the surgical masks, a year. That was our figure about a year ago, so we were using about 1 million. We're now running through about 100,000 a day. So that puts us at what, probably 300 million a year. If you're going to scale that up and assume that keeps at that sort of volume. So lots going on, lots of issues which I know everyone has encountered. But this has given us an opportunity as well, and there was already a lot of work going on in England and in Greater Manchester especially, to look at local supply chains, look at single-use plastic, look at reusable as opposed to single-use. And in a way, this has helped us move forward on this agenda at a lot faster pace than we may have been working on in the past, which has been quite interesting. So I think nationally, there's been lots in the news. Big contract just signed with NHS England and also Honeywell, who are going to open a new factory up in Scotland, producing 70 million masks a year. Those will be FFP3s, FFP2s, which are the respirator masks for those who use a different terminology elsewhere in the world. In other Greater Manchester, we've also been looking at reusable, and we've done quite a bit of work on this as well. If this works, I'm just going to share a quick slide. So that one is a reusable mask, which has been used quite a lot in Greater Manchester in the front line. One of the things we are looking at now, all the types of reusable masks, and you've got some examples here. And these are not so much in an actual medical setting, as in on wards. These are more for when we want to get our other staff back into work and almost seen as workwear. Quite a sort of a cost-effective reusable mask at about to £1.50 or so. Lots of other examples of also reuse, moving away from single-use gowns to reusable gowns. Some of our hospitals were already doing that and started to look at a couple of workwear companies in the region and also fashion companies have changed their output from being into fashion wear into gowns. Also, the prison service have been helping us as well out for making scrubs. So we're now moving into a phase of how do we get back into business as usual, and what does that actually look like? How do we restart some of our elective work, some of the operations which haven't happened over the last eight weeks or so? And there's a phrase coming back which is build back better. So it's given us the opportunity to not fall back into the, into the same way, same supply chain that caused us some of the issues that we've had. And can we do more now with our local suppliers, local supply chains, look at more reuse as a single use? Obviously, we've seen a massive increase in wastage in the system. So we're sort of seeing this now as an opportunity to really push on with the sustainability agenda, looking at reducing single-use plastic, looking at reuse, looking at local suppliers, looking at that local supply chain. That won't come without its challenges. We know from some of the work that we've already done, although you may find an organisation that wants to supply in the region, they then may still need parts or other goods that do come from the Far East. So we really need to look at the full supply chain here as well, which does make it just a bit more complex. Yeah, the ISO standards here are really going to help us as well when we start to identify these new suppliers and actually work out with them. So I think in conclusion, are starting to see this now as a massive opportunity in building the system and supply chain back in a better way.
So that's a perspective from the UK. Thank you for that. And Annie, would you like to give us a perspective from France?
Yes, thank you. What we observed during the crisis in France, first, buyers were under pressure, of course. We had a big dependence in low-cost countries like China and India. First, for active ingredients of our medicines. For example, paracetamol was the only medicine recommended by doctors and was made in India. Dependence for masks or other personal protective equipment were needed in hospital. And we were especially furious about masks because in France, in Brittany, we had a company producing FFP2 masks, 200 billion a year, 300 workers. It was one of the world leaders for this type of mask for many years. And when it was bought by an American company in 2010, Honeywell, you just talk about Honeywell, Neil, they sent the production in Tunisia in 2018 and destroyed the machine. So it's a real cruel example of delocalization only for profit. Another constat was bad management by our health ministry with not enough stock of PPE in hospitals due to low budgets and just-in-time supply. And of course, these products we were not strategic before, we call it category C in France, they become suddenly strategic and big volumes needed. And production was stopped in low-cost countries, transport too, so you know the story for all over the world. We also had a lack of tests to detect the virus and a lack of artificial respirators and hydroalcoholic gel. So that was the situation. What happened? I would say three main nice things. Solidarity and agility of many local companies, for example, to make masks. We have textile masks, reusable, and many textile companies have converted to provide solutions during the shortage, and now it's new skills developed. Imagination, we use diving masks, the new snorkeling mask from Decathlon named Easy Breath. It's not a joke. They adapted that in hospitals. For disposable masks, masks made in France were cheaper than Chinese ones, mostly because of the price of transport only by planes was expensive during the crisis, and worldwide the problem to supply them. And for barrier masks, for ordinary people, for enterprise, we have our standardization body, AFNOR. He has created a guide free for everyone with a standard to manufacture masks for non-sanitary use, I would say. And we had a lot of persons, everybody with sewing machines who produce them for companies or other persons. And even our big companies were solidarity, like cosmetic companies, they were offering to create hydroalcoholic gel. We had also developed cooperation and innovation, I would say industrial respirators, for instance. We had 4 industrial groups decided to ramp up and accelerate production of respirators. It was Air Liquide, Schneider Electric, Peugeot, Valeo. And we hope it's a new way of working for the future, cooperation between industrials. Innovation, we had a project named Maker. It created a prototype artificial respirators from 3D printing. And it was a fruit of the collective work in Nantes, where I live, west of France, of leaders of starters, researchers from the university, practitioners from the Nantes University Hospitals, but also for more than 250 women and men all over France. And in a very short term, they have made several units who could be manufactured for day in France and abroad. And I would say all the community of buyers all over France, they made a guide to share good practice, characteristic of personal protective equipment needed for companies, where to buy, a list of source suppliers and everything. So now what's the perspective for France? I think around after this crisis, of course, we hope that all this initiative will give birth to sustainable supply chain in each region, local supply chains, and promotes produce made in France. For instance, for active ingredients and of our medicines, we have Sanofi, which is one of our pharmaceutical leaders in France. He has engaged a relocation in Europe. It was planned before the crisis, but that it will speed up probably the relocation of active ingredients. We have to remember also why these active ingredients were produced in low-cost countries. First, because of the low salary cost, but also to avoid the more severe environmental constraints in France and in Europe. So it's not finished. And another concern about medicine is the selling price of medicine can be lower in France than abroad. So there is a risk to serve the best offer. And probably you've heard about recent public controversy over vaccines that are just starting with concerning Sanofi and their desire to serve American first, market first. So it's a big challenge. For hospital and management of healthcare system, of course, we think we shouldn't be managed like private enterprise. Maybe we have been too far with a lot of administrative constraints and low stocks. And delivering medicine too often, like twice a day in pharmacy, maybe it's not necessary. We could reduce all these flows and improve our carbon footprint. And we have a big issue with reevaluating the salaries of caregivers, doctors, nurses in France. It was promised by the government. It will be very expensive, but it must be done. Canada has already done that a few years ago. And in addition, as it's mainly women who work as nurses, it's a great opportunity to raise the gender pay gap. And most generally, I would say all these examples of reindustrialization and innovation are proof that French industry is able to produce masks, diagnostics, and other necessary equipment. It's a good opportunity to relocate strategic activities. And more relocation, it's equal less transport and better carbon footprint and more jobs. A good buyer who examines the existing source of supplier, he will assess savings in terms of real cost and risk taken, and probably look more closely at how to consider bringing their sourcing closer. And probably the post-crisis will likely lead manufacturers to revisit both their relationship with suppliers and the security of their supplies, and especially in very specific cases related to health security. And we think it's likely that suppliers, who has resisted to the crisis, they will take another posture with customers depending on the relationships they have observed during the crisis. And I would conclude to say, relating to what should be a sustainable procurement, first, more awareness about the risk in the supply chain. Then think about value creation, cooperation, innovation, work with suppliers over the long term with the most balanced relationship possible. Think about environmental and social and societal issues. We know that companies now who are doing the best performance are those who have the thought about social and societal issues. Think about local suppliers, and the ISO 20400 standard has clearly specified the concept of local supplier. We had a lot of talks together about this subject. Now we are full into the subject. And I know all countries are very interested in this subject. And last, think about performance. With sustainable procurement can be less expensive. And we developed in the standard the method of calculating the cost over the life cycle. And I hope the opportunity of this crisis, we should come of that stronger together for our lives and our planet.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Annie, for that perspective from France. So I'm going to Tanya now, who's from Australia, but I think, Tanya, you have very much a perspective around the developing world.
Yes. So lovely to see you all. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I have been, up until very recently, the Global Manager for Procurement and Sustainability for a iHealth International Development Agency. So with offices in 16 countries and working in over 25 countries, obviously the work is being delivered in developing nations. So the experience that we had as a health agency, iHealth, not any other type of health, so a specialist eye health agency, was as soon as our Chinese colleagues and staff members talked about the outbreak and the government shutdown, the impact to us. So the organisation doesn't actually go out and do eye surgeries. It actually supports existing health systems and medical resources, whether it's doctors, nurses, training, etc. So our first concern was our staff, who were quite close to where the outbreak was, and our staff asked us whether or not we were able to send them masks, because there were absolutely none available in China. So the moment that the outbreak, the pandemic happened in China, being one of the largest manufacturing areas for PPE equipment, all factories had all supplies diverted to the local requirements, and this was facilitated through the government. So our staff were unable to actually source their own, and it was very small numbers. I think we needed something like 300 to be able to get through a 6-week window. Beyond that, then the multiple partners in many of the countries that have been, particularly at the start, impacted quite severely, were asking the foundation to be able to divert and actually send PPE equipment. The foundation and the procurement team at the foundation, we didn't generally source PPE. So we were being asked to obtain supplies from the countries in which our staff were already working and had been shut down. We know that, for example, 3M were actually looking at, and this actually talks about how effective blockchain and being able to effectively manage your logistics and supply chain, were able to identify where there was additional stock in international locations and to be able to pull those back. Obviously, China had quite a large need. So that was really interesting from a technology perspective around the benefits that transparency in your supply chain and where your stock is, to be able to actually do something if it was at all possible. And from the Australian side, we're also remembering that this came off the back of the horrific bushfire season that we had experienced here. The Australian government had an enormous stockpile of, of masks, which had been depleted because they are actually supplied to people fighting fires. So we actually also, from a local perspective, had some issues with PPE equipment. So it's been quite interesting from an industry manufacturing pivot around what 3D technology was able to deliver in a really short time when it came to respirators, which I know Australia has participated in some of the innovations around that. But mostly what it really flagged for me is how challenging it is if you do not have 300 million masks that you usually procure in any one year. So if you're not looking at massive amounts of spend with established suppliers, being able to actually access stock was really challenging. It also highlighted the disparity between the wealthier nations and access versus developing nations. So many of, in the countries that we work in, use 90-95% local suppliers. So actually being able to access the distribution network when everyone was in fear was actually quite problematic. On top of that, it was also a highlight of the opportunity around, and I will confess I'm a complete nerd here, how due diligence, effective due diligence that is done properly at the start actually helps you have a rapid response in times of emergency. So having a due diligence process where you have vetted your suppliers based on sustainability considerations as much as risk. If due diligence had been something that the foundation, obviously because PPE wasn't a normal product that the foundation was procuring, if there had been due diligence in place, that would have created a lot of agility. And this is perhaps something that might be a little bit more common in the development space and NGOs rather than, hospital facilities. Another thing that it flagged for me was around hospital staff and the difference between procurement, strategic procurement and buying. As Annie flagged, that just-in-time sourcing, so what is available then when we absolutely need it versus being able to actually have an established supply chain where the due diligence and sustainability criteria is being integrated up front, which allows that mechanism to actually be able to engage really quickly. I think they were the things that really, it was quite confrontational and a little upsetting knowing that we had people at risk. However, one of the positives towards the end, particularly from the China team, was their engagement with the government and also sharing the learnings around the way that they managed dealing with PPE and the virus. So that was one of the positives. We were able to share that and share that through the partner network. I think the glaring thing for me was that sustainability just wasn't a part of the conversation. I started to dream about mountains of disposable masks with the little, the plastic pieces lying everywhere and what people were doing about it. But there was no conversation which was talking about how they were able to actually dispose of those. I know that on the plus side, there is some new technology around disinfectant, so the ability to have a zero chemical, negative chemical that can actually sanitize a room within 10 minutes, and that includes if you're out doing an outreach camp. So there was some pros and cons, but for me, I think the waste was the really glaring issue. And I didn't hear any solutions or any different conversation aside from incinerating the waste, and often in developing countries that's not actually, it's mixed. So you're looking at plastic as much as anything else being thrown all in together. So it was a big deal. The end outcome is that most governments and their funding for NGOs, there was agreement to be able to divert the normal project plans and activities to actually diverting it to procurement, which from the development space I think is remarkable. I don't often hear development agencies talking about effective procurement. However, I still was not hearing the conversation incorporating sustainability. So that was just my experience.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tanya. I'm going to James now and ask you for your perspective, James, again from the UK.
Thanks, Sean. Just a brief introduction. I'm James Cadman. I work for Action Sustainability, and I've been undertaking sustainable procurement work in the healthcare sector for a number of years now. So I'm just going to give you my perspective more broadly on healthcare procurement and sustainability. My experiences go back more than a decade to when the NHS in the UK was looking at energy efficiency, very clearly focused on carbon and the cost of energy and carbon as well in the kind of medical devices that we see up and down our countries in clinics and in hospitals particularly, and giving procurement people some kind of handle on, can you compare different products based on their energy consumption? Very simple process, very simple kind of calculator, but getting that way of thinking into the procurement process. So it's got a fairly long heritage. Moving on from that, there was another piece of work that I was involved in which looked at the procurement of uniforms and workwear clothing within the NHS, but looking more widely as well. And that was getting a lot more into the supply chain. It's looking away from just direct operational issues, but more into the supply chain and the sustainability issues that you see up and down the value chains that we procure from. But taking into account the user experience as well. So one of the little nuggets, the examples from that was about, well, surely we should be moving to more polyester uniforms because they're quicker to wash, quicker to dry, and they've got a lower impact in terms of the manufacture of those products. They're thinking about shirts and tabards, that kind of thing. Until the people we spoke with quite clearly said, well, they're not as comfortable to wear if you're in a hot theatre setting. So it's not a simple solution. So taking all those things into account really does help that procurement decision. And those kind of things are not alone in terms of what other products we can look at. There's a group of organisations you've probably heard of called the Sustainable Healthcare Coalition. They work with healthcare providers and suppliers globally. And one of the things that they've been looking into that I've been supporting them with is on the procurement of pharmaceuticals and medical devices. Predominantly around environmental issues, but sustainability more widely is definitely a key part of that. Sourcing locations, labour standards, and so on. We've heard quite a bit this morning from the other speakers about reference to labour standards and offshoring production to other parts of the world. All of this work has been done in the context of the ISO standard, of course. You know, whether it's being used explicitly or whether it's there as the background, it's always the context on which this work is done to try and integrate and embed sustainability far more deeply into the procurement of these products. Quite often the feedback we'd get is that the procurement people, the buyers and so on, would love to do more of this, would have a passion to be more sustainable, but simply in the UK certainly, simply don't have the resources or the right knowledge skills at this stage to do that as fully as they would like to. Having the time and the resource and the manpower to do that has been quite a serious barrier. And how can that be overcome? So one of the things that we've been doing more lately is working with the supply chain organisation that Neil referred to right at the beginning in his presentation, that works in between the healthcare providers in the UK and the suppliers. They provide that procurement service. That is their job. They are a procurement organisation. And understanding what those key sustainability impacts are for different products and categories. And it's heat mapping. If you know the standard inside out, or if you have a passing knowledge of it, you'll know that in the enablers part, there's something around prioritising and heat mapping where your key sustainability risks is. NHS supply chain have been looking at this, and it's interesting with COVID happening as well, how that has been affected and has been shifted. Originally, it was focusing on key issues of carbon, understandably, waste and single-use plastics that Tanya referred to, circular economy more widely, but also labour standards, ethical standards in the manufacturing process. Clearly, resilience is a big part of this now. Understanding security of supply, that's kind of always been there inherently, but the current pandemic has really brought this into stark contrast, stark relief as to a key thing that we would be amiss to not address. The experience from the stakeholders and the contacts I've had over the last few months is that it's been priority number one is getting stock in. Understandably, it's getting those pieces of equipment in, and dare I say, on some occasions, those other things that I've just mentioned have not been addressed because they are, there was not enough time. There wasn't the same level of priority. But as we start to see a very gradual easing of lockdown and the pandemic, these things are coming back into the conversation. And there's, recently, just in the last couple of days, there's been articles in the press about strategies for supply chain procurement, particularly around healthcare, but more widely. And the ones that I've been seeing have the UK context, but I'm sure this is applicable to many nations around the world, about onshoring or reshoring manufacturing capacity. So it's not all outsourced to the Far East somewhere, and the inherent issues that come with that. There's pros and cons, of course, but there are definitely issues that need addressing. Taking a step to one side from that, we're seeing a greater interest in the healthcare sector more generally in sustainable procurement. We get more and more requests for support around the standard, specifically around the standard, whether that's training or some kind of evaluation. But there's a growing awareness that this needs to be tackled. There's lots of reports out there in existence already that talk about the carbon footprint of healthcare sectors, and of course, like many industries, the vast majority of it is in the supply chain, and that's just one sustainability impact. You look at all the other impacts that we can talk about, and you'll find that they are in the supply chain as well. So I think there's a growing appetite. There is more demand for sustainable procurement and sustainability more widely in the healthcare sector. And if there are any silver linings to the current pandemic we're in, I think the urgency to look at procurement through the lens of sustainability more closely is definitely one of them.
Brilliant, thank you very much, James. So yeah, a lot of issues coming out of that. Tanya mentioned blockchain, and I guess really a question for Neil and Annie: how effective was inventory management before? I mean, I kind of understand that with the COVID crisis, the systems that we had were completely overwhelmed. But were the inventory management systems and processes that you had fit for purpose? Neil, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, so it was mixed. So we had some trusts which had fairly good inventory management systems, but we ended up introducing our own. Actually, we added a regional system, which, and I can see actually that Matt Oram from advising is on this call. So we'd actually worked with them and built a new system that was just for the PPE, so we could see across the board, across our region, how much PPE there was of each of the categories in each of the hospitals, and even wider, and that became absolutely key. And we still have to use that now, so we can see what the levels are, what the burn rates are. So how much is every hospital thinking they will use every day, every week, every month, and that allows us to have a good forward view on how much stock we have and how we got issues, and do we need to go and find more stock and highlight that issue. I think it's probably one of the things where we've learned, actually, where we talked about 18 months ago about actually having our own warehouse in the region, and the business case didn't quite stack up. The reason we were looking at doing that was around reducing the number of vehicles going onto hospital sites, with the obvious benefits that will give around air quality and also safety. It was said to us quite early on, if only we had our own warehouse. So at the moment we are actually using the fire service. They've got a massive site on the edge of the region, and we're using the fire training centre as a temporary warehouse. So I think yeah, it's a lesson, actually, stock control and the logistics, understanding what you have, where you have, and moving it around really quickly is going to be a key piece of learning.
Brilliant, thanks, Neil. Annie, any perspective for you from France on inventory management?
Yes, it was a big issue because our last Minister of Health, she made a lot of stocks and vaccines. I don't remember the name, the word for the grippe aviaire. I don't know the name, you know, the English name, but it was a few years ago. And she was very, as the pandemic didn't happen, she was very criticized. And so we have lived under the stocks for many years. And finally, when pandemic happened, we discovered that we had only a few stocks, and most of them were not functional at the moment. So I think there was also a lot of strikes for many months from the doctors and nurses, saying they don't have enough resource like medicine and everything. So I think we need a complete change, and we had a lot of administrative system in our hospitals more than care system. I mean, and we need a real complete change about our system. We saw also that was good practice during the crisis. Public hospital sharing with private hospital and sending people from one place to another to private, and so it was a beginning of cooperation. And I think to answer properly to your question, we should make stocks more to avoid, even if pandemic was already a risk. Everybody knew about this pandemic, but they always thought it was not really going to happen. So I think we should stock at least the compulsory medicine or mask or PPE, because it's much more too costly to stop all the planet like that for a virus economically.
Yes, thank you, Annie. Another issue that came up, Tanya mentioned due diligence, and Neil, in the UK, that there were lots of possibly quite misleading headlines about stuff coming in from Turkey. I think it was aprons from Turkey that turned out not to be compliant with specification. And I guess in a crisis like this, the sort of disciplines around due diligence tend to be challenged. Do you have a perspective on what you heard from Tanya and what really needs to be done to make sure that you've got a robust supply chain?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, we saw fairly quickly, especially with some of the headlines in the UK, that lots of people became experts very quickly in the supply of PPE. So it seems everybody seemed to know somebody that could supply us exactly what we needed, and it took a lot of time and effort to go through those offers and find out actually what was genuine and what actually wasn't. There was a lot of people that were acting as also middlemen, who said they had a supply in China or somewhere else, but actually they didn't quite have that stock, and they would go and attempt to find that stock. So it was really difficult. I think there was a lot of new people in the market that were playing at it. There was obviously a massive increase in costs, and we probably had now about 8,000 inquiries, or about 8,000 offers of supply over the few months, and it was a massive undertaking to actually go through those. And there was, there was some in there that were very genuine, and there were orders that we placed on the back of it. But it was a really good point. Having that due diligence in place, and having suppliers and having contracts in place, is key. I think in the UK, a lot of that had been done by NHS supply chain, which James had talked about as well. But obviously, with the increase in volumes and the increase in need, that capacity just wasn't there from those existing suppliers.
Thank you, Neil. We also have a question on the chat about fraudulent supply and profiteering, and sort of grossly inflated prices, and also some fake certification for equipment and those sorts of issues. Maybe if I can ask Annie if you've seen any issues such as that in France? Excessive increase in pricing and fraudulent transactions?
Of course, we had a lot of things like that for hospitals or for enterprise. And I know many people were sharing their knowledge of somebody in China who knows the right supplier and everything. And that's why I told you first, they made a lot of buyers from public or private sectors. They made a guidebook about what should be the real characteristic of products, who are the suppliers. They even made, even if I shouldn't say that, a blacklist of suppliers. But I mean, you know, and and we also had the issue about why the big distribution network, like big shops, had a mask and we didn't have in pharmacy. So there were a lot of issues like that. And I think it's going to be regulated now. I hope so, anyway. And to share is a good cooperation, and sharing should stay, I hope, for that.
Thank you, Annie. Yeah, we've got a message from Sanjay from India, who's seen similar profiteering during the crisis, but they've capped the prices now. I think, Annie, your point about sharing and collaboration, we also have a question from Emily, which I guess for any of the panel that care to respond. We seem to have built up a spirit of collaboration during this crisis, where maybe organisations that have previously competed have come together, and sometimes organisations that previously haven't manufactured medical equipment have found a way to do so. So, would anybody like to comment on, how do we kind of keep this atmosphere of collaboration going in the future?
I mean, I can tell you, I'll give a bit of a thought on that. I think one of the interesting things is we've probably started to talk more with our supply chain, which you may think is quite surprising, but I know, especially across Europe, a lot of this is done with tendering, where you issue a document and you might have done a bit of engagement up front, but it becomes a very legalistic process almost. It's always quite good to go and actually have a talk to suppliers or possible suppliers and actually work through what it is you really want and need. And and we've seen that in the region with some of the work that we've done over gowns and scrubs and masks, and I think that's probably one of the things I would really like to keep, that partnership working, which I think is often lost.
I find the health supply chain, I've only been in health for the last 7 years, one of the most opaque and strange supply chains out of all of the industries. And I think that if there's more conversation, particularly around procurers and sharing information, if there was consistent criteria around sustainability aspects up front, and people could actually access that information, the health supply chain and those suppliers would look very different. And as Annie said, around pharmaceuticals predominantly being now made in China, if we had transparency and had conversations both as buyers and suppliers around quality, expectation, and win-win solutions, then when the next pandemic comes, because we are working within a climate constrained environment, and this is just a window to what is coming. So how can we help reduce the burden on existing health systems by sharing information, having reputable suppliers on board, and actually looking at does globalization really work when it comes to the supply chain when you're in a scenario like this? Because what is society without an effective health system? So I think that the collaboration discussion piece is something that we can absolutely use as an opportunity moving forward.
If I can add to that as well, I've had conversations with people that take the conversation to a greater level of standardization. So I totally agree with the consistency of approach from the procurement side, but also standardization side from the suppliers, that that there isn't just one size fits all, of course, but there's a greater degree of standard products and materials that come out, so that you are more resilient should the next pandemic arrive, that you're not wedded to just one supplier or a smaller group of suppliers and supply chains, that you have a broader pool to go to, and everyone has that broader pool to go to.
I'd like to add also, we had a big power like citizens or consumers, and because we have seen what happened during the crisis, and now these firms who have been, for instance, producing textile masks, and now they see that companies are not buying anymore because business as usual, they go to low cost and everything. They react on social networks, and I think a lot of people want to change. We speak about the world after. I'm not naive, but and I hope. I mean, we have taken conscience about all these supply chain problems, and I think citizens also can try to force. I mean, companies, or even if we have salaries in the companies, to have more transparency in supply chain, to work in cooperation. So I think it could be a big movement. I hope so.
Thank you, Annie. We've got another question on the chat now, which is a really interesting one, I think. Do we believe that governments have a greater responsibility to ensure mandatory medical supplies are produced in country?
So if it's PPE, perhaps not. But pharma, I think that there is a case that rather than mandatory, I think there is definitely a case around looking at pharma being produced in different hubs outside. I mean, a single point of failure is, literally a single point of failure, so it's always going to be an issue. And if the predominant, there's pharmaceuticals are only predominantly produced in China, maybe India, then maybe we do need to consider what are the risks in that supply chain and how can we address that. Mandatory, I mean, I'm always a little bit reluctant to endorse mandatory, except for due diligence, of course. However, I think that governments definitely need to be prepared to facilitate as a central point on rapid response, whether it's public or private, in health, moving forward, because as I said, I think this is just an indicator of what's coming, and as we all need to rapidly deploy emergency supplies, well, how do we actually do that effectively, and how do we not compete with the existing public health system, which was something that we saw in some of the countries that we were working with, was our NGOs and the Western world that are trying to donate, are they competing with the government health system, and is there a better way to actually facilitate that in the future?
Thanks, Tanya, because there seems to be a sort of a global versus local argument here, and we've heard from Neil and from Annie about the push both in the UK and France, and I suspect other countries as well, to say we should manufacture more locally, we shouldn't be reliant on China. But then there's also a view around this whole issue of transparency and collaboration, which is driving us potentially towards more global supply chains and global collaboration. Does any of the panel want to pick up on that one?
Well, isn't that about exactly like ISO 2400, which is around picking what is relevant and appropriate for the context and what, goods and services. We can't do the same thing for high-end pharma as what we can for PPE equipment or surgical instruments. So having an appropriate strategy that is commensurate to the risk and the criticality, I think, is actually, an effective way to do it. It's not necessarily the way things really do roll, but integration of sustainability upfront, as was it Neil or Neil said, build back better. I think that's an amazing opportunity right now, and we should be jumping on that big time.
Yeah, thank you. I think this goes back to some of the comments that that Annie made right at the very beginning in terms of the whole issue of due diligence and transparency. I think we've got one more question in the chat that we can cover from Antonio Ramirez. We seem to be seeing increased interest in holding stock as opposed to lean inventory, to Neil's point of, if only we had our own warehouse. How robust is the demand data you've seen coming from contracting authorities? What provisions are in place to avoid panic buying and subsequent waste? We're mentioning increased collaboration within the supply chain as the healthcare sector's view on pushing risk to the supplier. i.e. a preference for a fast turnaround and ad hoc ordering, changed with COVID? Big question. Neil, would you like to respond to that?
There's a lot in there. So very quickly, I think holding stock is something we've always done anyway as a country. There has been a pandemic stock. So I think that will remain. How robust is the data? Well, because we're working across all our hospitals in the region, it's quite easy for us to actually spot any outliers if we think one hospital is overestimating or underestimating. So we've been able to manage that fairly well, and we think actually those usage figures and the burn rates are now fairly accurate. They will obviously change as we start to get back into business as usual, which will be the new normal, which is in the phrase. We're not going to go back to where we were, and we're still not quite sure what the new normal will actually look like. Have we panic bought, and will there be waste? Ask me in about 6 months, I guess, is the flippant answer to that one. Obviously, there is still concern over a second spike, but we don't think a lot of the items that have been ordered will go into waste. Risk onto suppliers. Not seeing a lot of risk taken by suppliers. Actually, they've been mitigating their risk and probably putting the healthcare system to make more compromises than they ever would do, especially with things like upfront payments, which we wouldn't have ever done, that we've done some of out at the peak. So I think that probably covers the main points there.
Okay, thanks very much, Neil. I think we're going to have to wrap now. So, thank you very much to our 4 speakers for your perspectives. I think we could have carried on this conversation all day. Thank you.